So, Professor Kaya, thank you very much for your very kind introductory words, and thank you also for mentioning my CV. Indeed, I joined the German Foreign Service in 1982. I was for many years at NATO in different incarnations, but I can assure you I'm not a cold warrior. Very important. So, dear colleagues, let me start with the younger people first, the younger audience here. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon. I'm amazed about the attendance that I can see among young students and professors. But I would like to welcome also my colleagues. And I see that I'm put at a test here today of professionalism and good ideas maybe. So we'll see if I fulfill your expectations. But let me first say thanks to TOBB University because you provide first the opportunity for this subject matter, and second the intellectual open space to address such issues, which I think is very important, and therefore also for the younger generation. I think that such a seminar, and you left it to me to choose the subject matter and the title and even the day, is necessary. Because when we look around us, the spaces for rational and circumspect behavior in international relations is shrinking. And intellectually, I believe it is very rewarding, and that is why I choose this title, to analyze the reasons for the current state of affairs in the global system. Now, I do not want to claim to possess all the right answers. So my approach is to offer one of possible answers to this subject matter, which is really multifaceted. And when I choose the title, The World in Disarray, one could also translate this disarray by saying that currently the world produces much more history than it can absorb. Or one can also say the world produces more problems at this point than we can absorb. So I would like to divide my talk, my presentation, in three main parts. The first part is I will explain why the period or the times of a stable world order is over. Second, I will then describe a few features which underline, or a few examples that underline how and why the world is in disarray, or why there are so many problems. And finally, I would like to propose ways how to deal with this situation and how we as Germans see possible way out of the current impasse we believe we are in. So I start with the first part, namely the dominance or the predominance of the Euro-Atlantic world since the end of World War II. And one could also replace the word predominance by the words center of gravity in international relations. The Euro-Atlantic world was and is no more the center of gravity of this globalized world. The Euro-Atlantic dominance was felt for decades and accepted for decades politically and economically. And the institutions this center of gravity produced have been providing the structures for an international order up to almost today. And let me give you a few examples of this center of gravity's role or predominance. Let's start with the UN Security Council. Still today, 3 out of 5 permanent members on the Security Council are from the Euro-Atlantic area, the United States, UK and France. When the United Nations were founded, only 51 founding members in 1945 participated in the foundation of the United Nations. Most of them were Europeans, and the rest from the other parts of the world, which at that point in time were still under colonial power, colonial rule, exercised by European powers. Another example is NATO, where I worked for so many years. So Western countries from America and Europe formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949 as an effective defense alliance. And the USA pursued a Pax Americana both in Europe and globally. The strategy was to multilaterally and bilaterally engage nations, such as through the so-called SEATO agreement, the Middle East Treaty Organization, and the Central Treaty Organization, in this region, by the way, of the world. So these are examples of the Euro-Atlantic, in this case American influence, in this part of the world. And in addition to that, European cooperation started to establish institutions such as the Council of Europe, the Western European Union. It started economic cooperation in the EEC, European Economic Community, which later became then the European Union as we know it today. And shared values in Europe led to the creating, which was crucial for shaping regional law. As I said, such as the Council of Europe, or the European Convention on Human Rights, which was a role model for other regions in the world, such as Africa. So this Euro-Atlantic thinking shaped international law in general. In the economic field, the predominance of the Euro-Atlantic world came through such institutions as the Bretton Woods institutions, like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, which until today dominate the economic development and financial regulation. And the Bretton Woods system established the US dollar as the leading trade currency until today. And also this engagement of the Euro-Atlantic world produced the so-called GATT agreement, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which later evolved into the World Trade Organization. So this Euro-Atlantic world shaped the world for decades, but these times are clearly over. And it is obvious that we have a situation in which the demographic factor changes the weight of global influence. And let me explain that by a few figures. In 1950, which was the year of the creation of this Euro-Atlantic order, the world comprised some 2.5 billion people, out of which 900 million were Europeans or North Americans. 900 million out of 2.5. Today, as we all know, the world counts 7.5 billion individuals, out of which still only 900 million, 1 billion are Europeans. In other words, the relative weight of the European populations or Euro-Atlantic populations has decreased considerably. And so has the gross national product of the economies, which before comprised some 70% of the global share and is down now to 50% in 2017. So in other words, the preconditions for the Euro-Atlantic influence in the world has considerably diminished. That is the balance of my first chapter. And here I come to the second chapter, which is a description of the world in disarray, or a world that is producing more problems than it can absorb. So what we have perceived over the past decades is a subtle but steady reduction of the Euro-Atlantic influence and a power shift to other regions in the world. Meanwhile, the contribution of the European economies to gross world emerging economies and regions is diminishing. We see booming economies in Asia, and we will soon see similar regions in Africa. As a result, we see that those Euro-Atlantic values and institutions that I just described, and which have provided stability and prosperity in the past, are today weakened and on the defensive. This is not only due to re-emerging players such as China, but mainly because of political developments within Europe and within the United States. So, for instance, the election of President Trump is a result of an American people and electorate who is increasingly inward-looking, self-interested, and internationally disengaging. And the pendulum between internationalism or international engagement and isolationism these days is moving backwards to isolation as we have seen it roughly 100 years ago. The Americans clearly are tired of interventionism. As I see it, their engagement in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, in Libya, has led to a point in time where the engagement in Syria is no more acceptable by the US electorate. This also goes for NATO, where the effectiveness and unity of NATO is challenged because there is a question of the protection, mutual protection in NATO based on Article 5, as the American president has put that publicly into question. And then there is also a reduction in trade liberalism, as we have seen it for so many decades. Leaving such important regional free trade agreements such as NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, or TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership with Asia, apart. And the confidence in the validity of international agreements based on the saying pacta sunt servanda, and regional stability are also tested if the US administration unilaterally withdraws from the nuclear agreement with Iran, which we very much deplore. But the current weakness of the Euro-Atlantic space also is the result of the failure of Europeans. So I do not want to simply finger point to the United States, but also the Europeans have left a vacuum, and that is stemming from several challenges. Number one, the 28 EU member states, still 28, are split on a number of topics that are crucial for the future of the development of the European Union. For instance, on migration. For instance, on criteria for financial stability. I'm talking about Euroland. And we perceive that very different understandings of our set of liberal values in the European Union is put into question. For instance, the Prime Minister of Hungary has created a new term, a new definition for what he calls illiberal democracies. Illiberal democracies. And there is an increasing, finally, disillusion with the European project in different parts of the European societies, the emergence of rightist parties who have a destination, and that is to say, we don't want this European Union any longer, in the Netherlands, in Finland, in France, and in other countries. And we see the Brexit, which is probably the case in point with regard to the disintegration of Europe, and there is even talk about Ital exit, a possible farewell of Italy to the European Union. And then finally, just to enumerate a bit more, to mention the European Parliament, which is today highly fragmented in different political groups and subgroups, and there are even parliamentarians in the European Parliament who clearly aim at destroying the European Union in its present structure. And we see at the same time assertive actors who are exploiting the current weakness of the, let's say, Euro-Atlantic oriented actors. One is, on a global level, Russia, as I see it, which has not fulfilled its obligation of the INF Treaty, which were just recently suspended by both the United States and Russia. And in the Middle East, in this region, we see that Russia is taking advantage of the strategic withdrawal of the United States from this region, be it Syria or be it Libya. In Europe, Russia has aggressively pursued its national interests and destabilized countries in its neighborhood. Let me mention Crimea, March 2014. Let me mention Georgia, 2008. And let me mention Ukraine, only recently, also in 2014 and ongoing. Another actor which is becoming very assertive is China, namely assertive with regard to her national interests, be it in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea, or be it vis-à-vis Taiwan, where they insist on reunification. And its concept of the Belt and Road Initiative is economically interesting, but may pose strategic and financial challenges to many countries who are attracted by the relative good conditions, seemingly relative good conditions, of this Belt and Road Initiative. And with regard to China, technology advance and technology modernization also plays an important role, because with regard to the modernization of its economy and its technology, as a state-run and directed economy, it is well protected with high-tech companies and its access to the massive amount of data without respecting individual human rights. So in other words, this challenge is also one which fills the vacuum that the Euro-Atlantic world is leaving behind. That I think we all have to be aware of. Which brings me to my third chapter, namely what can we do to fix this situation that I tried to describe. Number one, the farewell to a world that was dominated by Euro-Atlantic institutions, and second, a world that is full of problems in terms of no common ground with regard to the respect of laws and common rules in general. So, what can be done to fix it? Our solution to this situation, the German solution to this situation, is to swim against the tide. Namely, to strengthen those forces and structures that in the past have successfully provided stability, peace, and prosperity. What the world needs is, we believe, effective multilateralism that preserves a liberal world order. And as you might recall, some 2 weeks ago, Chancellor Merkel and President Macron have signed the Treaty of Aachen, which is a treaty of closer cooperation based on the Élysée Treaty of 1963, where Germany and France want to combine forces to fight for this liberal world order. And why are we doing that? Why is Germany striving for this multilateralism and this liberal world order? Because it is part of our core national interests. As a globally connected economy, the future of Germany depends very much on a resilient and rules-based international order. We believe in a world in which the power of the rule of law is far more important than the rule of the powerful. Therefore, the German diplomacy and foreign policy works for strengthening and enhancing institutions such as EU, NATO, United Nations, where we are currently a non-permanent member, OSCE, G7, but also effective formats such as G20, where Turkey is a member in. Formats, more informal formats such as E3+3, that is France, UK, USA, Germany, Russia, China, for the Iran nuclear agreement, something which has worked out very well until recently. Or let me give you another example, that is the so-called Normandy format, which is a format of France and Germany with regard to Ukraine in the Crimean crisis. With regard to the United States, we work towards a more balanced partnership. Clearly, the United States is irreplaceable for Europe, is a partner in NATO and in the fight against global terrorism. So the United States is indispensable for European security. However, we need to strengthen the European pillar in NATO and European security efforts in order to assure the cohesion and the effectiveness of the transatlantic security structure. Therefore, against public opinion in Germany, we have increased our military spending with view to creating a European security and defense union. And in this way, as I said, we work closely with France in order to coordinate our foreign and security policy, and that includes our cooperation as we speak in the UN Security Council, where France is a permanent member and Germany is not, and where we nevertheless have combined our forces for the 2 years we are in order to give the European voice a stronger impetus. In other words, Germany stands ready to contributing to fill the gap that the United States is leaving. Germany cannot do this alone, of course. Therefore, I say we are contributing, ready to contributing to fill the gap. To this end, we will step up our political, financial, and humanitarian efforts. But let me as well state here, before this audience, that Germany's strength is not to be a military power. That is a very important remark. Our areas of activities is rather diplomacy, civil crisis management, and conflict prevention. This is what we do with the Syria conflict. We provide security within the NATO context with our AWACS contribution, our reconnaissance planes in Jordan. We provide humanitarian assistance in Syria, and we are engaged in the political process, such as Geneva talks, small groups, Istanbul summit, etc. And of course, we do share with Turkey a huge burden in terms of hosting Syrian refugees. In Turkey, we have 3.5 million, which is highly esteemed also in my country and in Europe. In Germany, we have hosted 1 million Syrian refugees. So, having said this, I wanted to provide you with a few examples how we, Germany, can assist in providing security. I mentioned the importance and the power of free trade, and here we were a strong champion of the recently entered into force, 1st of February, of the European-Japan Free Trade Agreement, which started on the 1st of February and which covers 40% of world trade. So the 500 million Europeans plus 130 million Japanese adds up to 630 million people, covering 40% of the world trade. Since 2017, we enjoy also the benefits of the European-Canadian Free Trade Agreement, the so-called CETA agreement, which entered into force roughly a year ago. So these agreements, which Germany clearly supports and supported when they were negotiated, are clear political statements against protectionism and a zero-sum logic. And therefore, we believe in this concept, and therefore we also try to make good use of that in the African context, where we believe that we should support the African Union to establish its own free trade area. Clearly, in this endeavor, I mentioned security, I mentioned our work in the United Nations, I mentioned trade. In this endeavor of strengthening liberal institutions and mechanisms, we need partners. We can't do that alone, of course. And to this end, the German Foreign Minister called for the creation of an alliance for multilateralism. Alliance for multilateralism. This is not a formal alliance, but rather a loose network of like-minded, liberal-oriented partners which strive for preserving and enhancing a rules-based international order. The initiative is aimed at strengthening an effective multilateral order. It's not a closed club of liberal idealists, and democracies. It's open to all countries that are willing to engage in providing joint solutions to the problems today's world is creating, be it climate change, increasing protectionism, dealing with the global migration crisis. And we see countries like Canada or Japan, as well as many European countries, as our natural allies in this endeavor. I already mentioned France and the Aachen Treaty that was concluded a few weeks ago. As the French-German couple, we have agreed in Aachen, while signing this treaty, that we will formulate joint statements and positions, be it in the Security Council, in other UN organs, or be it with regard to positions in the European Union. And we want to coordinate our security cooperation even better, and therefore we have established long ago a French-German Defense and Security Council. All of this not only will strengthen our bilateral bond, France-Germany, but more importantly, the effectiveness of the European Union, because this bilateral cooperation should set an example for other European nations in securing a liberal world order which provides, as we believe, peace, stability, and prosperity for all. So let me conclude by saying that we live in turbulent times in this world. In disarray, liberal values seem to be on the defensive. However, this is not predetermined. This is not a natural law. Nations are run by human beings, and therefore human beings are also able to change the course of history, and that is what we are aiming at. The stakes are high, so we cannot afford to remain and sit idle. Germany is prepared to invest in a network of like-minded countries which jointly work towards a liberal, rules-based international order, and we hope that as many nations as possible will join this effort. So, thank you very much. I promised 45 minutes. I'm staying with 35. As agreed with the Dean, I'm now very happy to embark on a Q&A part of our session today. And I see there is one icebreaker in the front, please.
Hello, dear Ambassador. Thank you for coming to our university and giving this wonderful speech. I would like to ask a question about the demographics. As you said, the native European population is decreasing over time and the balance is completely over now. And from my viewpoint, as I see it, instead of fixing this problem and reinstating the balance, the European governments, especially being Germany, taking even more foreign and non-European and non-adaptive populations to their countries. And don't you think this is a problem? I mean, instead of increasing the birth rates in native European countries, you're taking even more and more immigrants which are completely not adaptable to your own culture. Thank you.
Yeah, that is a very relevant question. And depending on whom you have on the rostrum here, from a German perspective, you could get very different answers. But what I can tell you as an official, a representative of my government, is the fact that, believe it or not, in order to maintain our level of wealth and prosperity, we need 260,000 immigrants. The better educated, the better. 260,000 immigrants per year. Because of the demography that is as bad as it can be in Germany, in Japan, and in a number of other European countries. So if Europe wants to maintain its relevance in the global economic sphere, we have to address the issue of demography. Not by raising birth rates, that is not possible. You cannot do this organized by states, or only in a very limited way, but by allowing for immigration. The current population in Germany is 83 million people, out of which 10 million have a migration background, meaning they were not born in Germany. And we believe that over the last decades we have shown, starting with Turkish migrant workers in the 60s, that we are able to absorb and integrate these foreigners into our society. So this is the way forward, and I frankly don't see any other. So I'm looking around.
Yeah.
Another icebreaker, please. There's a microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your presentation. I have two questions. One is, you stated that Germany's side is with the liberal, like-minded groups for a rule-based international system. How Germany is planning to tackle, if I may choose the word correctly, illiberal movements within and outside Germany? This is number one. Number two is, how long do you think the Bretton Woods system is going to last? And if Euro is posing any challenge to the existing order? Thank you.
So I start with the latter because that is the easier answer. It seems to me that the US dollar, based on Bretton Woods, is and will remain the leading currency in the world. Because there is no other strong economy than that in the United States. Or if you want to put it in a different perspective, there is no other place in the world where the financial markets have so much trust in stability, the economic conditions, financial conditions. Therefore, even though there is the euro and even there is the Chinese yen, no, it's not yen, it's Japanese, but the Chinese currency, I don't see any real challenge to the US dollar. That is my first answer. The second answer is, you said that we are lobbying, and I said we are lobbying for liberal approaches to many areas in the world, and that we need like-minded nations at our side. And there are illiberal tendencies in the world, in Europe, and in my own country. The rightist movements that I refer to in other countries are also active in Germany. I think the only way for a functioning democracy is to set a good example and to show that liberal markets and free trade are beneficial for all of us. And it seems to me that with regard to the Brexit, people in the UK, of course in Ireland, but mainly in the UK, start to understand that the price of the Brexit, and therefore a limitation to free trade within the European Union and free migration within the European Union and many other things in the European Union, that this Brexit has a high cost. And on a daily basis, I'm listening to the radio and I read the newspapers, and I find on a daily basis new proofs that the Brexit has much, much higher costs than anybody expected. Because there's a whole sequence of consequences. When you look at one item, you all of a sudden understand there are interconnected items to this one. And therefore the consequences, the chain of consequences for the Brexit in individual sectors of the economy, the society, etc. are enormous. And therefore, I think it shows that isolationism, the denial of free markets, is is not positive but negative. So set good examples. Professor.
Thank you again.
So there's a micro in the back.
Thank you again for this insightful talk. Başak Yavcan from TOBB University of Economics and Technology. You've mentioned about well, you've been listing the areas of crises and disarray in the world today, and one of them is obviously, as you mentioned, the rising number of forcibly displaced people, hence the refugees. And EU member states' response to the refugee crisis has been one of under great criticism, yet Germany's efforts to come up with the multilateral order that you've been arguing for has been really important in this process. I'm curious as to what Germany did to convince for a more fair burden sharing across the EU in terms of resettlement or sharing the refugees who came throughout 2015 and 16, and why do you think, I don't want to say it failed, but you know, movements like Visegrad 4 came out and it didn't reach the goal that Germany had foreseen. What were the obstacles, in your opinion? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So indeed, you used the terminology failed. I would put it this way and say that our recipes were not so successful. There are multifaceted reasons. I think one of the reasons you mentioned Visegrad for is that European countries, the 28 still that we are, have a different history in migration experiences. There are countries in Europe, such as Hungary, who have never ever experienced the influx of migrants in their country. And there are a number of other European countries for whom the acceptance of migrants from remote places, such as Africa or Syria, simply is not imaginable. And this we have to accept. We simply need to see that the experience and the historic past of European countries does not necessarily allow for the influx of migrants. That is one resource, I would say, for the lack of willingness to share this European burden. The second reason is, obviously, the rise of political parties that have xenophobic xenophobic basics. And that is also a fact of life to which governments have to pay respect. In other words, there are a number of constraints, including the social financing of refugees, which to European nations put limitations. And these limitations simply are a fact of life, and we have to accept it. Therefore, we praise the Turkish acceptance of so many refugees, not only from Syria, but from Iraq, from Afghanistan, and beyond. And we also appreciate a lot the so-called Migration Pact that was signed in March 2016. So Turkey and Germany in this respect read from the same sheet. We have similar experiences. We are both very much exposed, also because our societies to a certain extent accept this influx of migrants. And Chancellor Merkel has always referred to, as did the Turkish government, to the humanitarian need and acceptance of accepting migrants. So that is my answer in a nutshell. Two reasons: xenophobic political parties and a lack of historical culture in accepting migrants from remote places, not from neighboring countries, but remote places. Please, the gentleman on the left.
Mr. Ambassador, first of all, welcome to our university, and many thanks for this comprehensive speech. My name is Orçun Demir. I am a graduate student at International Relations Department. I would like to ask a question about energy policies and energy issues, particularly Turkey and Germany. As you know, the Turkey is taking steps for nuclear energy, and on the other hand, Germany decided the nuclear energy phase out. What do you think about these two countries' energy perspectives, nuclear energy in particular, and energy perspectives in general? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. As you know, the transformation of the German energy market from coal to renewables, from fossil energy to renewables, is like the repair of a flying aircraft. So it's a very, very ambitious endeavor, and the German energy consumers, especially the consumers of electric energy, pay a high price for that. But still they accept it, because we have to fulfill our aims concluded with regard to global limitation of global exhaust. But I want to answer your question in a more specific way, because you asked Turkey and Germany. We ran through this nuclear period since the 1960s up to 2021, when the last out of 15 nuclear power plants will be closed down forever. The reason for that is that there was no more acceptance in the German society over nuclear energy, civil nuclear energy. And today we are experiencing the high costs of that exit from nuclear energy. Because you cannot only look at the production costs, low production costs of nuclear energy, you also have to take into your calculation the dismantlement of nuclear power plants, which is extremely expensive, roughly 3 billion euros per power plant. So you have to factor into the running costs of a nuclear power plant, let's say over 30 years, the dismantling costs. So all of this in addition brings me to the point to say to Turkey, don't go through this phase. Avoid investments into nuclear power plants, because renewables today are on the market and they are much cheaper than ever before, and they exist today. They did not exist when we joined the families of nuclear energy producing countries. If today we had to make a choice between renewables and nuclear energy, as Turkey can make, Turkey has the choice. The German society would never ever be ready to invest into nuclear energy. And Turkey is a country that is so destined to produce renewables at a large scale, be it solar energy, be it wind energy, and compared to Germany, the surface of Turkey is 2.5 times as big. So there's ample space to plug windmills all across the country, in your mountains and what have you, far away from urban centers. So, in other words, it seems to me that the investment, the economically expensive investments into nuclear energy in this country are an impasse that one should not choose. Because in 30 years you will be confronted with the same challenges as we today, namely you have to dismantle those. And that is also very expensive. But that is then the endeavor of the next generation. So maybe not something politicians take into consideration today. I hope I answered your question. There was another one in that area. Voila, please.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for this informative speech. I am Selim Yıldırım from the International Relations Department of TOBB Economic and Technology University. I want to ask that you have mentioned about the rising populism and rightist parties in Europe and also over the world. I want to correlate the question with the Turkey and the EU policies. I think when you mentioned the illiberal democracies of the world, I think about Turkey also. What I want to ask is that what is going to EU and Germany do about the Turkey's illiberal democracy and rising populism of Turkey? Because as I know, EU and the Turkey's harmonization process is such an start. What is going to do EU and Germany about this problem?
With regard to Turkey?
Yeah, regards to Turkey. Thank you very much.
So, Turkey clearly is part and parcel of Europe. And for my understanding, there is no other geopolitical destination for Turkey than Europe. And I think in this university most people would agree with this statement. But of course, to be a member of the institutional club of Europe, which is the EU, and not all European nations belong to this institutional club. Let me mention Switzerland, let me mention Norway, Iceland, a few others. In order to become a member of this institutional club, you have to obey to certain standards. These standards are called Copenhagen criteria. And these Copenhagen criteria are valid both for the customs union as well as for accession talks. And therefore, the European Parliament, the Council of Ministers, and Germany calls on Turkey to come back to these commonly agreed principles and criteria as enshrined in the documents of the Council of Europe in Strasbourg, in the European Union accession documents such as the Copenhagen criteria. That is all I want to say on this. Maybe we change to this side again. The gentleman in the red pullover.
First of all, I would like to thank you, Mr. Ambassador. In your extensive talk, you emphasized that sound is problematic or okay. In your extensive talk, you emphasized that EU as an organization should be strengthened. But you know, some say, and it was one of the main reasons behind England's Brexit decision, some say strengthening of the EU would just mean that strengthening of Germany. Because you know, Germany dominates the European Union. I mean, I would like to know what would you respond to those claims. Thanks in advance.
The answer is that no individual country can dominate the European Union. The European Union and its institutions were created because we wanted to move away from experiences of pre-World War II and I, namely a continuous competition of European nations on the question who has the say in Europe. And this question, who has the say on Europe, has produced many, many wars over centuries. So the agreement after World War II was to move away from this coalition building in Europe and from the predominance of individual nations to the negotiating table in Brussels. And this is the place where today the combats take place. in a very peaceful and organized manner among 28 member states. And that is the only way forward. Should any country in Europe try to be the unproclaimed leader, it would fail. This is why Germany, for many decades, has put together its forces with France and the UK in order to form a steering group of nations within the European Union. Unfortunately, UK is now leaving. It's a sad story for Germany, because UK and Germany in the EU is both liberal and free market-oriented economies and societies have cooperated very closely with each other, as well as, of course, with France. So what you need in the European Union is an agreement of the larger nations to set an example with regard to the way forward. And a good example is, in this respect, Eurozone, where first France and Germany agreed to fuse their currencies. And then the Schengen principles is the same, where not everybody is part of in the European Union, but where the bigger member states have set the example. And that is the way forward, not the role of any country, including my own, as an informal leader of the game. The lady at the extreme right. Geographically.
His Excellency. Thank you very much for your presentation. Digger Demirtaş, faculty member here at TOBB University. You have mentioned the European standards and the Copenhagen criteria. And in Turkey as well, whenever we think of the European Union, we remember the European values. But you also mentioned the problem of illiberal democracy in some of the EU member states. And I think we can say that in some EU member states, some EU member states are not fulfilling the conditions of the Copenhagen criteria in 2019. When you think about the authoritarianism, especially in some of the Central European countries, according to your opinion, what should the European Union do in order to bring back democracy to those countries? Because if the EU itself, if the EU member states cannot set a good example, how can we expect the European Union to play a leading role in global politics and to fix the problems in global politics?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So we have to set the good example as European Union. That is not always easy, because we see that all politics are somehow local, and that local developments have consequences for national positions. In that respect, there are within the European Union certain mechanisms to sanction the country. You may have heard about it. This is a co-decision thing between the Council of Ministers, or the European Council, and the European Parliament. And so far, there was no clear agreement or unity among member states to apply these sanction mechanisms, with one exception, and that is many years ago with regard to Austria. So there it happened, but I think the experience of these sanction mechanisms were, in the case of Austria, not so convincing, that today people say we should rather have a very, very careful look at using these instruments, because it would mean to corner a given country. And therefore, it seems to me that European Union institutions are extremely careful to apply those mechanisms, and I think that is the right thing to do. Our approach to this is to convince leaders of given nations where fundamental rights and the rule of law are not respected to the way they should, and to enter into a conversation with these countries. We do this on a bilateral basis regularly, government-to-government consultations, etc., and try to find through this avenue an improvement of the situation in a given country. So that would be my answer. Thank you. So, where are we? I think we exhausted our time. Mr. Dean, it's 20 minutes to 5. The agreement was 4:30. And therefore, I thank you for your patience. And I thank you for the invitation.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Yes. Well, probably this is the same one that we gave you before. Is it? No, I don't have it yet. This is different, is it? Okay.
It's the first.
I think you have.
Let's have a nice one.
Thank you. All right.